Hello, everybody. This is the Q&A session for chapter 11. And today we have Dr. Susan Davis-Becker for responding to the questions of the group. So thank you very much for accepting to participate today. I prepared like a little bio about Dr. Davis-Becker to introduce you. So, well, I mean, Dr. Davis-Becker, she's the founding partner of ACS Ventures and a member of the current CME board, and she's also a board member of the Association of Test Publishers. Dr. Davis-Becker earned her PhD on assessment and measurement at James Madison University and a master's degree in psychology also from JMU. She worked before as director of professional credentialing at Alpine Testing Solutions. And she also worked as well as assistant director and project coordinator at the Burroughs Institute of Assessment in University of Nebraska-Lincoln. She has published many papers and book chapters related with credentialing, standard settings, alignment studies, and many other interesting topics. So yeah, we are very, very happy to have you today. And yeah, I think you're an excellent person to respond and to ask the questions of this chapter. So thank you very much.
Sure. All right. Would you like me to just dive into the questions?
Maybe let me share my screen to at least show the list of the questions.
Great.
And give me 1 second. Let me also put in the chat the link to the invitation board so people also can see the questions. So, can you see the screen?
Mm-hmm.
All right, so this is the list of questions for today. Unfortunately, not that many, but yeah, we can see how we go here. So maybe let's start in order, I guess. In your opinion, what are the new challenges arising from micro-credentialing? Should the new standards speak about them more explicitly?
Sure. Well, I'll start by saying that my view of the standards, the entire document, is that they all require some level of interpretation, right? You've got to do some kind of connection between what you're working on and what's written there, because in order for this little book, essentially a little book, to apply to all of these testing programs, they have to have some, I want to say, generalities to them, or not vagueness, but just, again, broadness to them. So they all require interpretation. I don't think it's very rare that I use like a direct quote from here, but rather say, hey, this is what this standard means, and here's why we're going to do it in this way. So that's my take on how I view them. So when I look at something like micro-credentialing, for those of you who don't know what micro-credentialing is, it's a growing area of credentialing that really represents kind of typically smaller certifications. We may think of the more broad credentials that are out there that encompass both licensure and certification. And that may mean a medical license, a pilot's license, an engineer's license. It may mean a certification to be a personal trainer, a certification to be a teacher in a particular field. They can be quite large. Micro-credentials, though, are a growing area that I feel really reflects the fact that our world is constantly changing. We're seeing the need for more credentials. And maybe older generations chose a field and stuck with it and stayed within that one professional field, where newer professionals start in one field and maybe go to another. And so we don't want to make these huge onerous credentialing processes in order for you to demonstrate a growing skill set. So the micro-credentials may be smaller things. They may be something called an ABC, which is an assessment-based certificate. That means it's a certificate to show that you learned something based on an assessment. So that's really similar to like an end of course test, if you've ever if you looked at the educational standards and thought about those. So again, you design a learning course, you take a test at the end, and you get some kind of demarcation at the end. That's an ABC. Stackable credentials are a way to think about, well, I want to get to this level and then I want to add this and add this. So you can literally stack pieces on top of a base. So you can say, well, I've done the majority of the work, but now there's a new piece out I want to certify on. So those are kind of a stackable type of things. There's other types of certificates. And again, in our field, we've really defined often what a certificate means versus a certification. A certification, again, means you're going out looking broadly in the field. What does the field expect? What does the job require? And a certificate is smaller, where it might mean, again, you've shown learning or knowledge or experience in one little area. I can operate this software. I can explain these concepts, something like that. So do we think about them as the same? We look at them differently because they're typically lower stakes. They typically are smaller in scope. But I think they can definitely be guided by the standards that we have here. Again, if they're based on an educational experience, we can draw more in that area, which I think is a great way to show that connection between the two. But if you start with, like, I think it's standard, like the first standard in the credentialing and workplace chapter, it talks about defining the purpose and really building your validation framework around that. So your purpose will be smaller, your focus will be smaller, but you can still create, meaning out of what is that validity argument and what do I need to support that. I think we're going to continue to see more and more of those micro credentials. We work with a lot in the credentialing space, and they're also growing vastly in higher ed, where higher ed institutions are wanting to give their students credit and recognition for specific accomplishments that they can carry over to other opportunities.
The comments, reactions.
I will say, if anyone's interested in diving in more to credentialing and wanting to learn about it, there's an organization called the Institute for Credentialing Excellence, or ICE. That's part of the NCCA, the National Center for the Certification Accreditation. So this organization accredits credentialing programs, and they built a set of standards against which they accredit programs. And that's mostly for large-scale certification programs. And they actually constructed their standards, drawing from a number of resources, including this. But then in recent years, they've built one for certificate programs because they realized there were so many of those and they wanted the recognition of being an accredited program. So they built specific standards for there. And where you see differences are things in, like, how do you define your content domain? For a certificate program, you probably won't do a job analysis. It's just not needed. So a little bit, I'll say less stringent requirements.
So let me see if I understood your response. So you are saying that in the standards there is enough for navigating the complexities of micro-credentialing in particular.
Mm-hmm. I believe so. I think similarly, like, we're seeing different scales of assessment in education with more formative assessments and through course assessments. We're seeing all these different, like, sizes. I think we can still use the guidance that's in this book and we just have to, in our mind, like, translate how would I interpret it in this context? Mm-hmm. And I think it's the same context, or I think it's the same guidance, different contexts.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Comments? No? All right. Let's move to the next question then. Let me share my screen. Who should be in the table deciding, quote, the nature of the job itself or other decisions about what a credential demands in a person?
Yeah, you typically have two layers of individuals involved in defining the nature of the job itself. The first group is what we often call the sponsoring organization. Who's building this test? Who's creating the certification? It's their certification. They're going to put their name and label on it. What are the bounds they want to set? For example, the I work with a group that certifies group exercise instructors. If you've ever taken a group exercise class at a gym or even online, that person was likely certified by one of several organizations. How this group defines, well, what is group exercise? Is it more than one person, more than two people? Is it a particular style of class? So one of the things they had to do from a business perspective was sit down and say, what does group exercise mean to us? How far do we go into specific, there's brands out there of group exercise. If you've ever gone into a gym and seen stuff that was branded based on a particular fitness company, do we get into the brands? Do we try to keep it high level? How do we do that? And so they had to sit down and define for their business case of offering this certification, what is it they wanted it to do? And they may be out talking to employers like health clubs and saying, what would benefit you? What kind of certification would you be looking for? What kind of knowledge and skills? So that's like the first group that's typically involved at a, again, very high level. And I'll say they're kind of setting the bounds on what we can and cannot do. And then the second group is the group of subject matter experts that typically participates in a job task analysis. So you can imagine, again, with group exercise, I might go get individuals who are teaching at a small gym, at a private facility, at a big gym. They're teaching online, might get all of these people in a room and say, okay, tell me about being a group exercise instructor. What does someone need to know or be able to do? And we might spend a couple of days hashing out these expectations and delineating that. And so that's subject matter experts. We often then send that out to a survey, a larger group of individuals or group exercise instructors in this case, and get feedback to say, how well did we represent your job? And so again, you can imagine pulling all that information together, but those are the two layers that are usually involved in the process. Most significantly are those subject matter experts.
Yeah, okay. Any comment, reaction?
I have construction outside, so ignore that. But what happens when the two parties don't agree maybe on the certification piece?
Sure. So if you say, for example, your sponsoring organization has set bounds and said, we're not going to get into topic X, that's not where we're going, then, and your subject matter experts in the room say, but I use topic X a lot. How do we do that? I was just working with one last week where we had this issue, and it was a matter of the laws pertaining to the professional field. And so the individuals in the room said a lot of what they do is have to interpret the laws in order to make sure that their organization is operating within the bounds of those laws. Well, the challenge is this is an international certification. We had people from all around the world in the room. And so you can imagine that the laws in the UK are different than the laws in China, which are different than the laws in Nigeria, which are different than the laws in the US. So to be able to test on specific laws and get into that knowledge, we just couldn't do it. So what we had to figure out how to do was to capture a statement acknowledging that each individual is working within the bounds of their legal practice, but that our focus for creating this outline was on those common knowledge and skills that everyone had to have, regardless of what country or region they were practicing in. So ultimately, to say, the answer would be the sponsoring organization gets to make the determination. Now, they want to keep their subject matter experts, supportive of their program. If they left that meeting and said, this certification isn't going to mean anything, it's worthless, that's not good marketing. And they wouldn't go out and take it. They wouldn't encourage their colleagues to get certified. So we have to find that right balance.
Topic that I think we have discussed in the past in the study group is how what's the role of the users in test development, in test validation. So when it comes to credentialing, the user, because usually in the standard, when you say user, you're thinking on an institutional user, if you want, like someone that is going to use an instrument test to do like a wide decision. But also we have been thinking if the examinees at some point or test takers are users or not, they should be. In the case of credentialing, the test taker has somewhat use of the test in the sense that they are going to have like like a like final outcome from doing the test. So what do you think in general, or what have you seen, at least in the world of credentialing, regarding the experiences of all different type of users, and if you really need to include those people in the decision process or not?
Yeah, that's a good question. Credentialing is different from education in that sense that you may have test takers in the room helping you develop the test. So if it's a brand new program, it can be difficult to find people because everyone wants to take the test. And so you might have to find individuals who are willing to delay their credentialing experience so that they can be a part of that activity. Other times, if it's a more mature program and you're engaging in item writing, item review, standard setting, all of those activities, you're going to draw on people who are credentialed and ask them to come and give back, essentially, provide service to their professional community. This is one way they can do it. In some fields, this can count towards their continuing educational requirements. There's some groups get a very tangible benefit out of it. Others do it as a way to build their network, and some do it just for the fun of being involved in test development. So they're asked to come in and share their experience and expertise and write test questions or review them, advise on setting standards. These are all individuals who've likely taken the test. And so now they get to be on the other side of it and help with that experience. So they're directly involved. We may also include employers. So maybe people that aren't full subject matter experts, but people who employ those individuals and say, here's what I want this person to know and be able to do. We might include educators, so those who train the professionals to do the job. And then sometimes in some activities, you might involve a member of the public. So again, most certification boards, so the board overseeing the entire operation, will have a public member, someone who is not a subject matter expert, they're not credentialed, but they represent that protection of the public piece. And what does the public expect out of the medical license or the contractor's license or the certification for an irrigation specialist? What is that? What is the public really looking for? They may not often have an opinion on every topic we discuss, but they can represent that interest there.
Okay, so you see that there is a value to include those voices.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah. Any comment, reaction? Today I'm very shy. This is not good.
It's Friday afternoon.
All right, let me share my screen and see the next question. Can you clarify more about the phrase? There is not a clear need for job analysis to support criterion use when measures of absenteeism, turnover, or accident are the criteria of interest. That is in standard 11.7. It's a very specific question, though. So
yes, I had to look this one up, and the first thing I will say when I read the question, I was like, "What?" But then I did look it up, and this is me getting to admit where I do and don't work very much. This chapter covers both credentialing and workplace testing. So credentialing is often what we will think about when we think someone gets letters after their name, like this is the credential that they've earned, or they're able to, qualified to go do a job, something like that. Workplace testing is more about finding individuals who are good fit for a particular employment setting. And this comes in many different forms. Some bigger companies have their own form of doing this to try to find fit. They get thousands of applications a day. How do they weed through them? They want to find those individuals that are going to be a right fit for their opportunity. Some of these may be very just small tests. Some may be very big and involved, maybe more like structured interviews. So I'll be honest, I really don't work in workplace testing. You often see that more in the IO psych area. So that's where our two fields really overlap, but do have distinct areas of focus. So I had to go back and read this. And my interpretation of this, just knowing what I know about workplace testing, what they're suggesting is if you're trying to predict job performance in the form of absenteeism, turnover, so thinking, showing up for work, not quitting, not having accidents, if that's your criterion of interest, you don't need to do a large scale job analysis. You can gather that data based on your company work records. You don't, and then go back and say, well, what types of employees led to, had lower absenteeism rates, lower, were less likely to quit and had fewer accidents. And so you don't have to say what knowledge and skills do they need, because that's really what you care about, is that they show up, they do the job, they don't quit, and they don't have accidents. So again, that's obviously a more specific job role. You wouldn't, again, think about that for your physician as an employer, but for some job roles, that may be the base criteria they're looking for.
So this sounds like the purpose. If the purpose is more descriptive, then you don't need to do any job analysis.
Right. I'm imagining this would be like some type of large scale company, maybe warehouse workers, for example, and they get lots of applications and they want to look and saying, what can we track about the individuals who applied, who were more likely to show up to work, to not quit, to not have accidents? Can we identify any common characteristics and then use that in our screening protocol to decide who to interview out of the 1,000 applications we get? And that just would be, so again, that's not really deciding who's qualified, but it's just saying this is going to be our first group to really focus on for hiring. So again, that's within the standards that are specific to employment testing or workplace testing versus those that are more specific to earning a broader credential.
I remember when I read that part, it makes me a little bit nervous when I read that, because it reminded me a lot of the type of argument that people use sometimes in artificial intelligence, saying that you need to focus more about predicting something. And if you can't predict, then you're fine. And not worrying that much about understanding how exactly is that you're predicting, and not entering into the discussion about a construct necessarily, but more about like some technology or algorithm that kind of works, and and kind of the theory agnostic, if you want, like not worrying that much about how exactly is that you are coming with a conclusion, just targeting a predictor. And also kind of remind me the history in test validation, in which, I mean, in the 60s, 70s, validity was considered a correlation, and how we move from that view to a more holistic view, in which there wasn't like a only single source of evidence, and never a criterion is by itself enough to kind of interpret the results of a test. So yeah, when I read it, I was like, I mean, that sounds slightly like that, like trying to come back to worry much more on the prediction of a criterion that is chosen without any problematization, and like opening the door to that, for that to happen. So yeah, when I read it, I was like, I mean, I made the question. It was like, I am understanding this correctly or no? So after the way you are interpreting, I think, yeah. Do you think it is really going backwards in the direction of blind prediction or not?
Right. Yeah, I think it's a very specific use case there that we often don't see in the work we do. As I think you mentioned, in credentialing, we don't do a lot of predictive validity. What we're trying to do is determine if someone has the knowledge and skills for safe and effective entry-level practice. So as long as they're at least entry-level, we sometimes say at least minimally qualified, we don't care where they are beyond that on the scale. We just care about that 1 point. because you have to think about the flip side. If you do not give someone, or if you do not award someone a credential, there could be a lot of significant downstream effects of maybe they don't get the job they applied for, maybe they don't get the promotion, maybe it costs them a lot of time and money to try and retest. So we can't say, well, this is going to be the ideal candidate or the best person on the job. We're saying what is minimally qualified. And as a candidate, we're asking them to meet or exceed that level. And so we obviously, those who are less than qualified, we don't let them into work. We don't give them that opportunity. So we can't really say, the people who we thought would fail, did they actually fail? We can't predict that because it's not, it would be not protecting the public if we let them into the job just to gather data or do our predictive validity study.
I have a follow-up about that. So after getting that credential, then is it a matter of those micro-credential factors contributing to your mastery after having that bare minimum to do whatever is necessary? Or I'm more so thinking about how those credentials are going to be communicating with the micro-credentials. Or are they going to communicate at some point and speak to each other what they are doing, how they are complementing each other in some ways? Like, or are they separately viewed and definitely independent of each other?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think in each field it's a little bit different. Sometimes those micro credentials allow you to show that progression. Sometimes it's experience in the field, just growing and learning. I often use the example of, again, a minimally qualified doctor is safe to go work, whether they're working in a hospital, working in a private practice. But then you think about what helps that doctor really grow in their field. And you might think about if you've asked someone for a referral for a physician, usually what they think of when they're saying why they like their physician, it's not about minimum qualification. It's about great bedside manner, great service, really putting in the time and effort for their patients. So that's the kind of thing that I often think helps someone really grow in their career. Our job is to make sure they have safe and effective entry-level knowledge and skills, and then they can grow beyond that. In the field of medicine, there's a lot of board specialties. So individuals can go on to get board certified in a particular area. So working in credentialing, I would say if you're looking for someone help in a particular area of medicine, go find someone board certified in that. They've put in the time and effort to show they have extra knowledge and skills in a particular area. So go find that specialist. In other fields like IT and other things like that, where the field's changing so quickly, those micro credentials that can be developed rather quickly really do help people identify those new skill sets, and then in turn help employers find in those individuals for suited jobs. I think some of the micro credentials just haven't made their way into mainstream language every day. So we're going to continue to see that grow as individuals start acquiring more of them, and then employers or the public starts recognizing what they signify, and that it can be a useful tool in identifying the right person for them.
Thank you.
Any other comment, follow up? All right. So next question. Were the standards prepared to advise practitioners in credential and workplace testing on the issues that the COVID-19 pandemic created? Are there standards that appear to be needed because of the things that happened during the pandemic years?
Yeah.
Maybe let me give one little bit of context here. We had a session with Dr. Cullen on chapter 5 about cut scores and scaling, and actually he made this very smart observation, or he gave us like a hint of how to evaluate the standards. And he mentioned this idea that, okay, let's see the standard and let's see how they were helpful to navigate the problems of the COVID pandemic. And by doing that exercise, you kind of can see through the standards and see like which one were really helpful. There were gaps that maybe I think that we are not including the standard, but actually the pandemic showed that were important. So I kind of repeating that question now specifically in this context of chapter 11.
Mm-hmm. I think it's a great question and a great point by Dr. Colin. Obviously none of us were prepared for the pandemic. Even programs that I worked with that were fully online and testing online were not prepared for what the pandemic led to. So I think, but though I'm going to go back to saying, like, again, what I mentioned at the beginning, that I do believe that we can use these standards as a starting place for interpretation and say, there's nothing about a pandemic in here, but let's see what we can learn from this. Let's see how we can apply it. I think that the credentialing programs I worked with faced two major hurdles when it came to the pandemic. The first and foremost was when the testing center shut down. That, they were so used to using this network of in-person facilities or doing a large scale, I'll say, mass testing event. They couldn't do that. And so some of them just said, well, we'll just wait for things to reopen, right? Remember, we thought it was going to be a month, maybe a month. Other groups said, we don't know when it's going to open again. We've got to do something. And then some groups were really struggling because, for example, respiratory therapists, right? We needed respiratory therapists certified as quick as we could, but they couldn't take the test. So we didn't want these patients who were experiencing this phenomenal, worldwide pandemic to get a respiratory therapist who, hadn't been certified and maybe wasn't competent. That's not fair. So that was the first hurdle. The other hurdle that groups faced was a lot of programs have prerequisites to sit for the exam, and some of those may have required in-person work. Maybe it's in-person physical, like hands-on training hours, hands-on internship or experience hours. And especially in the healthcare settings, because they were not considered essential, interns or things like that couldn't be in those settings anymore because they had to keep as many people out as they could. So all of a sudden now they couldn't get the experience that we said is necessary to sit for the exam. And so we had to, in both instances, we had to take a step back and say, okay, what are we doing here? And I think the biggest thing we thought about was just this idea of what is a standardized exam? Can we move this exam online? Will that create a fair experience? And the first thing to recognize is that standardized does not always mean the same. Standardized means it's comparable. Everyone has an opportunity to show their knowledge and skills. And so many programs did navigate that process of transitioning their testing program online. We hit lots of bumps, we hit lots of hurdles. We had to work with those early candidates who tested. We had to monitor the data. But we did, and many candidates had a good experience and appreciated that they could test from the comfort of their own home, meaning they didn't have to go out into a public setting, that they didn't have to wait months for a test center to reopen. So that we navigated that and it worked well. Now, some would still argue that it's not a standardized experience, me sitting here interacting with my computer versus someone going to a local center. And I think, again, we have to break down and say, what are those requirements for standardization? We know that testing center A looks different than testing center B. The room temperature is different. There may be construction noise outside. I may have had to drive through an hour of traffic to get there, so I'm anxious because of the traffic. So there's so many things that already destandardize our testing experience that I think just figuring out what are the metrics we want to look at. We know they're not all going to be the same, but what metrics can we evaluate to determine that? And I think from the standards, the standards emphasize a lot about reliability, decision consistency, and test scores. So we can use that as guidance to say, those are two important metrics for us to consider. Do we still have confidence in the decisions we're making, whether someone's at home or in person? With respect to the prerequisites, that was a little bit tougher. Many programs just had to waive those temporarily and say, some of them could move some things online and say, okay, we're going to do some courses for you online. We want you to participate in those, and you can try doing some things physically at home to again get that experience. Others just had to waive it. Student teaching, for example, was a big requirement that got waived. We didn't have to do that. And they did it. And of course, no one complains. No candidates are going to complain when they don't have to do something. But as they're trying to bring it back, programs are getting pushed back over the last year as they've brought back those same requirements, saying, wait, you're going to make me do this now? Why? And people have done it before without it. And, you as a program, you want to say, but it made us nervous, but we're not as confident. And we feel like this really sets you up for success on the exam. So that's been the harder transition back when we seem like we're adding back in a requirement that wasn't there for so long. So again, with respect to the standards, I think we all had to do a very thoughtful reflection on what does standardized testing really mean. We had to push ourselves to say we can't use the same definition we used to. We've got to do something different now. We've got to think broader and make sure we can keep things moving. And again, some of those programs just had no choice but to keep moving. Others, it was a business decision. And then, some just were hesitant to move to the online world, but then eventually did so because the pandemic lingered for so long.
Very interesting. Yeah, I'm starting to think about where in the standards is mentioned the idea of standardization, and if there is enough principles to navigate that or not. I'm trying to remember, but yeah, I think that actually might be something important to consider in the new version of the standards. Like, what do we mean with standardization, and if it makes sense or not, looking back to everything that happened during the pandemic. Yeah.
Right. And so I'm an external consultant to programs. I don't work for one particular program, but for multiple. And so we were in the role of advising programs through these crazy times. And, we had to think about what can we defend? What could we justify and defend and say, the results from this person testing at home and this person testing in a test center are comparable. And so you learn about and of course, the big thing about testing from home, we thought, was people were going to try and cheat. People were going to try and steal the exam. We really haven't seen any mass incidents of that. Rather, what we saw more was it actually, people didn't do as well sometimes testing at home. And I think they thought it was like, oh, I'm just going to pop on a Zoom meeting and I'll take my test. But there's a lot of security checks to go through with your device in the room. You got to show them around the room. You've got to do all kinds of things. And sometimes people were more anxious because they were worried about their own technology. What if my Wi-Fi fails? What if my computer has a glitch? And all this, they were worried because they were now responsible for it. So we actually saw pass rates go down in some of these programs when people were testing online, because the nuances that they were now responsible for versus going into a place and saying, here is the computer. It's good to go. No worries about the computer. Just sit here and test. It was a new experience. And so just like our first few virtual meetings were probably very bumpy, this launching an online test was very bumpy. People are getting more accustomed to it. And we've had some candidates say, can I just go to the test center? I'd rather just go. Can I just go? And
really?
Yeah, we've had some ask, I'd rather just wait. Is it going to be open soon? And so some have asked for that in-person experience because they don't want to fail because someone walks through the room, and they don't want to fail because their internet gives out. And we've had some of those, and people just had to, unfortunately, if their internet goes out, we have to restart the test, and that's just stressful. But if someone's off for 30 minutes, you can't just let them back in a test that they've already seen questions on. So.
Wow. Complicated. Any other comment, reaction?
Do you see any companies consider these factors when setting cut scores for any of these exams?
Yes and no. I'm actually involved in a research study right now with one of the credentialing organizations that, again, accredits those credentialing groups. Many programs, again, saw that dip in pass rates in 2021, and 2021 in particular, because in 2020 is when everything shut down. A lot of these programs wanted to move online. Well, there's only so many test administration vendors, so they essentially had to build up a queue. So some groups got moved online by the summer of 2020. Some of them, it took them later in 2020. So 2021 was really this year where a lot of programs were all of a sudden now only testing online or mostly testing online, and their pass rates fell. And a lot of programs panicked and said, we should adjust the cut scores. But it was more of a quick reaction versus saying, well, let's dive in and look at why. Is it those technology glitches? Is it people stress, like having an added level of stress? And even though you want to be considerate of that and you want to be kind to individuals, when we go back to saying this is about protection of the public, we can't, give bonus points or lower a cut score because it might be a little bit more stressful. We still have to think about what is that standard for minimum qualification.
Yeah, you have an asymmetric cost in terms of the error. So like moving up or moving down the cut score have very different implications.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe our models are going to include some sort of margin of error due to such complications.
Mm-hmm.
If they're keeping the log information about those glitches and things happening, maybe that would be helpful.
Yeah, I think the programs that do this, the technology vendors that do administration, the groups that do the remote proctoring, whether it's through AI or human proctoring, they've been building their systems for the past decade, and the past 2 years have given them a lot more data to work with. So I do want to give them credit that things are getting better, and it just takes that time to just keep trial and error on things. And so I feel like things are getting better. And again, it was just a, as we all say, everything was weird for the past few years. And so testing was included in that. But I think it's encouraging us to learn and learn more and grow. I will say that a few years ago, pre-pandemic, again, the major accrediting bodies for credentialing programs did not accept online remote proctored exams as a standardized form of administration. And they said, no, that's not acceptable. So you couldn't be accredited and administer online. Now they were starting to consider it. They were engaging in a pilot program. I think they were collecting data at the time on a few programs and saying, we want to support this with data. And then the pandemic hit. And so a lot of their accredited programs say, we don't want to lose our accreditation, but what do we do? And so they allowed groups to engage in remote proctoring, and then they had everyone report back data, and they were using all that data to support the idea that remote proctoring could be a standardized form of exam administration. So again, it's helping things move in that direction. That the very unfortunate pandemic did help, something like that accelerate its timeline. So that's been helpful for many programs.
I have a follow-up again.
Yeah.
Do you know, to the best of your knowledge, as far as you're consulting to those credentialing companies and all, if they are aiming to improve their real-time monitoring of those remotely proctored tests and all?
Yeah,
and
there's
do interventions maybe in real time, or troubleshoot cases in real time? Do they have any efforts in that regard?
Yeah, there's so much right now that's happening. So again, we started with human proctors, so it would literally be a person watching you, watching several people test, and they're looking for a series of things. Maybe you looking around the room, maybe you picking up something you shouldn't be picking up, or things like that, or trying to fire up another application on your computer. None of that. Now, within the past 5 or 6 years, we've had an explosion of AI companies that are trying to simulate and track those same things, with computer intelligence. I don't know of any program that solely uses AI. I think they use AI to identify a flag and quickly notify a proctor who's watching several people at the same time. And then we do also have some programs that do record and review. So no one's actually watching you, but you are being recorded, and then your session will be reviewed. Typically, that's a little bit lower stakes because they don't want to, most programs can't risk you stealing their exam and that they're not identifying it for a week. So they need to see in real time if you're trying to take a picture or do a screen capture or something like that, or talking to someone else in the room. So it's getting better. The technology is continuing to grow and to build. In terms of interventions, we haven't seen much other than, again, it would shut down the tests. Often what I've seen is, what I've heard are more like someone might get a warning, like, don't read the question out loud. And it's like, well, who else is in the room? Don't read the question out loud. So they might give them a warning and say that's going to violate a policy. And if they keep doing it, they would shut down the test session.
my own personal research interests. I've been studying or trying to understand more about user experience research. And I have had this, I mean, I think every time when you question the idea of standardization, when you go more into comparable experiences, yeah, you need to know more about the actual experience of each test taker. And I can see how that type of research actually can help to improve and to make a case for these situations in which you may have different modes of assessment, and but still you want to have like comparable interpretations. And yeah, I think that, well, yeah, the pandemic has a lot of bad things, but at least that one thing that I like a lot, actually, that highlights the value of user experience research and the need for connecting with what's happening with the test taker. That should be done anyways. I think in general we should worry about that, but now we have like technical reasons also to worry and a value for that type of research to be done, because it can help to make a better case in these situations. Even if, in my thinking, or on this examinee that you mentioned that we wanted to go back to the in-place testing. Even if that could be possible, that would have so many COVID-related stuff that I don't think it would be comparable to the regular or previous in-person way of doing tests. So even in that case, you will need user experience research to understand what happened and how these specific things. Actually, I remember in Chile, there was a situation of people doing the test during the pandemic and asking whether, for example, using a mask was a problem, and doing like research about that. So yeah, I don't know. Like in general, I think that at least one good thing of the pandemic is that it highlighted the value of user experience research.
Right. I heard a story about someone who, I'm not sure, I don't know what program this was with, but they said, well, you have to have a blank wall behind you because you could have a camera or something hidden in any of these, or I feel like Maggie's got books there, you know, they could be a camera hidden in there. So the only blank wall they could find in their home was in the bathroom. So they took their test in the bathroom. So that's not an ideal experience either, to like be sitting in your bathroom taking your certification exam. So the proctoring has gotten better. The rules around it have gotten much better since we've had so many more use cases. And then of course, even with the pandemic, most people they were not at home alone, right? Nobody was home alone because everyone, you know, who lived there was there all the time. So the idea of being in a completely noise-free blank room was just impossible for a lot of people. And so
it was
again,
just a privilege, actually.
Right, exactly.
You need to have a lot of money to have like a room exclusively dedicated a few hours to take a test.
Exactly. And so things have gotten much better as we've broadened our use cases, we've gotten much better at thinking about how we can do this better. So again, I'm not involved in that space just from an outside consulting perspective, but just massive growth in the past few years that we'll continue to see growing.
I guess people of Sergio's question, I'm wondering, you know, if you are sort of flagging behavior that's unusual, but a student is like a neurodivergent student who needs to like play with a fidget or do something where they're kind of staring off into space for a while, or even reading the questions out loud to themselves because that's part of their disability. They need to actually like sound it out to like understand what it's saying. I'm kind of wondering how these systems kind of account, even with a human score, like how they account for a sort of you know, unusual examinee, so to speak.
Sure. So I think, again, not an expert here since I don't work on it. So, but my understanding is like a lot of the credentialing ones for adult, you know, again, thinking about adults more than kids, but we still have adults with a lot of those same disabilities. They're still pretty strict. Now they do lay out all of the things like you can and can't do. And I believe you can apply for an accommodation if you have a documented disability, that you might be able to get around some of those normal flags. So it would be, again, like you said, a fidget, the reading out loud, things like that, that again, you might be able to you know, you could probably look around more easily in a testing center than you can in your own home, because again, what's there? And then they may ask you at any point to turn your camera around and show us your room. So you have to be prepared to quickly show that there's no one else in the room with you. But I believe like through a lot of the accommodations processes, some of those can be handled, but it's being very mindful of what is it I do normally and my own behaviors. compared to this list of acceptable and non-acceptable behaviors.
Very, very interesting. Okay, I think we have one extra question. Let me. Yeah. So why the diagram in page 172 does not include response process, or does it? So maybe let me go to that. I think it's referring to this diagram.
Yes. So I think, so first thing I will say is that these were probably written 10 years ago. So again, they were published in 2014, I believe. Yeah, so the idea of response process modeling it's been around for a while, but really more popular, I would say more common to talk about more in more recent years. So I think that's the first reason why I don't think response process is maybe mentioned anywhere in the standards. I think it could be inferred as being a part of the predictor construct domain. So again, the idea of what is the response process indicating as part of that construct domain, the knowledge, skills, abilities, traits, dispositions, and values. So I think, like with respect to response process modeling, I tend to think of it as we're trying to, model a knowledge or skill or ability in practice, maybe even a trait or disposition for particular employment tests. But yeah, it's not explicitly mentioned in there. So I would say yes and no, sort of implicit, not explicit.
I see. Any comment, follow-up?
When do you think response process data should and should not be used in credentialing?
A great question. I would say when it can be defended for making a high stakes decision. I think there's a lot that can be learned from response process data. Absolutely fascinated by so much of the work that's coming out of there. But again, with credentialing, you have to think about every decision you make, everything you put on your content outline or test specifications, every question you write, you have to think, could I defend not awarding someone a credential because of this? And so therefore, if it's an extraneous question or really high level of requirement, or saying this is the only response process, that might be tough. So, but I think, again, that's an evolving field. So I'm not going to say it can't be done. I need to think more about that one and where we can go with that.
Counter question, how is response process data, the we think of it, different than an evaluator watching someone do a process for a part of their assessment, like dentist?
Sure. So for example, in the dental exams, there's a little bit of, I guess you could say, process data, but it is about the outcome. So for example, dentists have to complete a filling on a person during their exam, and that's checked at you have licensed dentists looking at it at 3 points. First thing is the dental candidate will bring in a patient and says, this person needs a filling on this tooth. And here's what got my instruments ready. I'm ready to go. The dentist checks to make sure, yes, in fact, there is decay. It warrants a filling. You're good to go. Then the person removes the decay. The dental candidate removes the decay. Before they do anything else, dentists again check it to make sure, did you get all the decay out? Sadly, did you drill on the right tooth? Did you do this without harming the individual? Make sure that you didn't cut them in any way or damage any other teeth. And so obviously that's part of their response, I guess, and we will stop the exam if in fact they've done something that's egregious, if they've hurt the patient in any way or not set them up for success. And then they complete the filling, and then the dentist again checks, did you put the filling in correctly? Did you file it down? Did you make it fit correctly? All of those pieces. And so I guess we're ultimately interested in the outcome, which is, did you complete the filling? But we have to watch along the way to ensure that, once the filling's done, we'd have to take an X-ray and look for any remaining decay. And we may or may not be able to fully see it like we can when the tooth and the dentin is exposed. So that's more of a safety check versus saying we're tracking different ways of response process.
Yeah, maybe in the question there is a need to clarify what is response process, because sometimes in the construct you are asking for a process. So the fact that you know how the process should be done is part of the construct. But even in that context, you still have like what response process in a way that how do you really think through the process itself that you are doing. So that will be the real response process in that case, because it will be more about your cognitive processing while you do the process. So yeah, it's kind of weird that it's like two processes on top, but yeah, maybe that should have been clarified in the question.
And in credentialing, often we acknowledge that there's multiple ways to get to a correct answer. You just have to get to the correct answer or provide a viable solution. Or, you know, again, dental fillings, there's not a lot of ways to get creative. We don't want them to get creative, but it's more about, did you do these key steps? And often we're looking for more what we call auto failures. Like, did you commit any of the automatic failure errors? And if you didn't, then you pass.
Do you think in that regard that our like content domains that we are testing people for is going to expand in a way that is going to include those like process data? What process data tells us in terms of their skills and all. So like maybe we're going to look at a broader description of construct given the ability to observe what they're actually doing and how they are handling things. Do you think it's going to affect all our description of how the content domain looks?
I think one of our biggest, as a sort of answer to that question, hopefully, I think one of our biggest challenges in credentialing is trying to test people in a way that as closely mimics the job setting as possible. And part of that is recognizing that people have different ways of doing things, different ways of responding and getting to the intended outcome. So the more we can push ourselves to think about how do we allow for individualized approaches to the same problem and still allow for all of those to be correct or acceptable, I think is good. The challenge a lot of times with that is, again, are we getting into the unstandardized? Are we creating something that is super expensive to build and score? It's finding all of that balance, but I think we will continue to push ourselves to think about how we can do that better. And that's just going to increase, I'd say the public's acceptance of what we're doing, candidates' acceptance of what we're doing. You hear a lot of, oh, we don't want another multiple choice test, but again, it's hard to move beyond that, cover the content domain and keep it standardized so that we have confidence in our results. So we're working towards that. It's just a continual process. And we're enabled by things like technology and AI and automated essay scoring. It's just working through all of that.
All right, I think we are on time. Thank you very much. This was really, really good. Thank you for your response and for accepting to participate today with us.
Great. Thank you all so much. I think it's great that you're studying all this.
All right. Let's stop the